And so when you had these steppes, these wilderness, you could just send the excess population out into the wilderness, which is, one theory for how the Indo-Europeans spread, that they're just perpetually sending out these waves of young men, the Kourios or whatever, and we don't know how historically accurate that idea is, but you do see this trend throughout history, and Europe did it during the Age of Exploration with basically the whole world, right? Just sending out guys to conquer various places and to settle.
Salvete, Legionaries. I am joined by a very special guest you've seen before, and of course are familiar with his videos, the Ark, who has recently been face doxed on Uber Boyo's show. Very handsome guy, in case you all were doubting the authenticity of his claims to aesthetics. And he is here on this show today, and of course his last video was on the end of history. So I thought we might talk about the end of history and perhaps break down with a critique of many of the leftist views of the end of history, particularly the Hegelian and sort of liberal Fukuyama end of history type stuff that I don't believe we subscribe to. But anyway, welcome in, Ark. Where are you coming from today?
Today I'm coming from the Arctic. I did an expedition up there to see if it could be a potential location for the refounding of Rome. But it's a little bit cold. I'm not used to this cold. I'm not sure how the pizza baking would go up in this weather, if we could get the ovens hot enough. So I'm not sure.
Well, the Italian futurist Marinetti actually wanted Italians. He had this thing called the Futurist Cookbook, where he wanted to just change everything, including Italian cuisine, and he wanted the Italians to go from pasta to rice. So maybe he's actually a forward thinker. He predicted that you would go to the Arctic to seek out a place for new Rome, and he thought, in the Arctic, if we can't make the pasta, we have to make the rice. But anyway, welcome in, Ark, and thanks for joining us from the Arctic. I'm sure it's a very perilous journey. But sort of going back to your recent video, which I think we can use to kickstart the conversation, of course, there is this leftist liberal perspective regarding morality, which I think is very unfounded and very naive and very basically flimsy and breaks down upon itself, as we see in the past 10 years. See, for the listeners, I think there's two particular end of histories I want to bring up. And of course, I've mentioned Hegel and Francis Fukuyama. It's essentially this idea that as humans advance and as we progress towards a specific morally good ends, and ends where we will have universal justice, universal equality, all these different things. The Marxist view is slightly different because they believe that you achieve these things through the sort of equal distribution of capital, the elimination of unnecessary hierarchy, the elimination of property, whereas the sort of liberal worldview is still an attempt to solve the end of history materially, but of course through things like the free market, protection of property, etc. But ultimately, the naivety of these positions, as the Ark goes into in his video, is that you're taking all these universal principles of egalitarianism and equality and justice and assuming that there will be this sort of collective acceptance of them throughout the world, which has proved not to be true. The Francis Fukuyama prediction was that we'd reach an end of history where all the countries of the world became liberal, and if every government was liberal, nobody would go to war with each other. But as we've seen, certain cultures have a predisposition towards different forms of government, different political philosophies and ideologies, which has resulted in, quite frankly, a very faulty assumption on behalf of the liberal West that they could simply regime change the rest of the world to eventually having this sort of, almost one world liberal government, which has proven not to be true. So before I go on, because I have more thoughts on these specific topics, I don't want to run on too much. I guess before I go on, I'd like to pass it on to the Ark and just get a general overview of your position. Maybe you could bring up some things that you talked about in your video, for example.
Yes, well, I think the main thing I was hitting on is kind of history as eternal resurgence, not necessarily eternal recurrence. Um, but I think there's kind of two camps that I hear commonly, and one is the end of history camp, uh, or kind of the progress of history camp, which I think is probably the most common. Most liberals today have some version of this, and I think most conservatives too. Viewing history kind of coming out of the darkness, the depths of time, and slowly we're advancing more and more. Um, and then the other one is the kind of almost Hindu one, the cycles of history, right? History just repeats these kind of generic cycles: empires rise, empires fall. But I've been making lots of videos recently on the idea, the kind of pagan idea of nature and fate. And that the idea that fate is one's nature basically played out across their life. And so I was trying to apply this idea then to civilizations, to peoples, and just looking at the history of the West, it seems like what we kind of see, it seems to me at least, is a constant reemergence of kind of the original founding spirit of the West. And, at times it's been suppressed. So, for example, Rome was founded out of this pagan ethos, honor-based values, belief in fate and hospitality and all these classic European pagan things. But by the end of the empire, it had kind of wandered far from that original ethos. Um, but then you have a reemergence of this, and it just happens again and again in the Renaissance, in the chivalric age. And so the hypothesis I was trying to put forward is that every civilization, every people has a kind of founding spirit, and that they fall insofar as they stray from that spirit.
Yeah, so we could certainly delve into that, which is more so looking at the symptoms of decline uh, historically, which certainly have been uh, very apparent that there is this sort of uh, general symptoms of illness and the lack of hygiene of a polity or empire. Of course, we can look to Spangler for this and look at the symptoms of decline in empires. I think another interesting perspective to look at this from is that the cyclical view of history did not take into account that the world would be drastically changed by the emergence of technology. And something that a lot of philosophers talk about, guys like Marinetti, the futurists, Jason Giorgiani talks about this, is the primacy of speed. Speed is not taken into account, and specifically the speed of technological advancement. And of course, what technology allows for is to sort of concretize systems in a way that past uh, peoples could not. So, for example, technology has always proven to shake up the social order. Take the discovery of iron, for instance, right? And then, of course, you have the Iron Age invaders, you have the steppe peoples expanding and whatnot. Initially, the technology of just farming and agriculture gives you a massive advantage. It allows you to uh, essentially expand your population, and population is going to be crucial to a polity or people's power. It allows you to build settlements, right? You build large walls. You get to focus on other things. You get to focus on advancing technology, etc. But then along comes iron, and the warlike peoples who utilize iron more properly are able to circumvent the uh, the technological advantages of the agricultural peoples and essentially sweep them, right? So technology has always sort of shaken up our established beliefs and our established recognition of patterns. And I think today, the rapid advancement of technology and potentially technology towards a point of singularity has a lot of ramifications regarding as well the cyclical view of history. Because we have to think about the fact that, um, you know, people like Spengler, people before Spengler, right, the Romans, etc., all these people operated in a world with a very clear set of rules. And, we can go into the symptoms of decline in empires, but just to summarize briefly, in the case of Rome, for instance, they started to rely heavily on slaves. The slave population grew larger and larger. And what that meant was the Roman aristocrats, or the base Roman population, were becoming more and more reliant on other peoples to essentially run the empire. So they weren't innovating anymore because they didn't really feel they had a reason to innovate. They say, well, we have all these slaves, we have these large estates, the slave, farm the estates. What need do we have to make better technology, to enhance farming? Or what do we need? What do we need better technology to enhance our building techniques if we could just rely on all these easier methods, right? So of course you have a stagnation of growth in the empire, and all these things, right, are confined to this specific set of rules. You grow weak, you grow decadent, you grow lazy, you grow comfortable, you grow pleasurable, whatever, and your empire declines. But today, with the rapid growth of technology, it seems to me that once you reach a point of technological advancement where, for example, who the first people to potentially actually, let's simplify this. If, for example, when America was the first country to develop the nuclear bomb, imagine they just nuke the hell out of all their enemies, right? Got rid of every single threat to the American empire. How might that shake up global politics in a way where, it doesn't matter how decadent of an empire you get if you have this sort of secret weapon, this secret technology that essentially, proves any other power trying to attempt to take power from you null and void. And this is, of course, the position of General Douglas MacArthur. He just wanted to bomb the shit out of the Soviets and the Chinese or whatever. So I'm going on a little bit of a rant, and maybe we need to bring it back a little bit. But I think another thing to consider regarding the cyclical view of history, things like you're talking about, like the sort of Hindu Evolan view of the Kali Yugas and golden ages and whatnot, how might that change once we reach a point of technological singularity? And essentially, whoever reaches that point of technological singularity first, they're going to have this enormous power to sort of dictate which systems are in place and which systems have primacy over other systems, which ideologies have primacy over other ideologies, and potentially concretize their power in such a way that you won't see the cyclical revolution of history anymore. And like I said, we'll go more into that, but I don't want to drone on too much. You are the guest after all. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Of course. I guess the question, though, is the U.S. already has nukes, right? And yet we're still experiencing the classic imperial decline from basically all the same mistakes which the Romans made. And, do the nukes really make a difference? Would it make a difference if we had gene editing? Would this happen anyway? And then I think the other issue, though, with the cyclical view of history is it only seems to happen to large civilizations and empires, right? Like there's plenty of tribes which have basically maintained continuity throughout the ages, and they might suffer various troubles and so on, but they don't experience this these cycles of history, which implies that the cycles of decadence and so on really only apply to civilization and large scale civilization.
So what I would say to that is generally when you do have a small group, right, that's able to retain its essence, it's generally because they're so far removed that from other peoples that they don't have the threat of falling. Of course, if you're too small to defend yourself, right, then essentially you're vulnerable to any force larger or stronger than you. So if we look at like the North Sentinelese, for instance, right, technically they have 40,000 years of uninterrupted, their culture being practiced in that small island. But if tomorrow, one guy with an AR-15 were to land on that island, it would be wiped out. It seems to me that, as you say, these small groups of people that have lasted for thousands of years generally have only been able to do so because they are detached from being conquered by other peoples. It's not necessarily that their system allows them to sustain themselves. I think a good example, actually, of a culture that has largely been uninterrupted for thousands of years would be the Han Chinese. Uh, their culture, they've retained cultural and ethnic homogeneity for at least 2,500 years. Of course, the first Chinese emperor, Shi Huangdi, I believe, came about around 500 BC, I want to say. It could have been a little bit later. And then, though you have multiple dynasties, you have, at least a dozen different dynasties from that period all the way to the current Chinese Communist Party ruling over China, they have retained largely the same political systems, the same culture, the same ethnic body, even after being conquered multiple times or having regime change. So that's an interesting thing potentially to look at. Well, how were they able to sort of avoid this cyclical view of history, or cyclical strike of history? And I think largely it's just because there's so many freaking Hans. There's so many of them, so it doesn't matter how many times you conquer them, the conquerors will always just be absorbed into the conquered in their case. So maybe there's something to be learned there. Just have a shit ton of kids. I mean, I know the Ark wants to do that, right? You want to have like what, 20 kids with 5 different goth girls?
At least, so I can become like the Han and resist the Kali Yuga. Um, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there is a difference though between being conquered and falling to decadence. Like, again, so like Rome, yes, I guess they were eventually conquered by the Germanic tribes, and they faced various threats like that. But really, what did them in was a kind of internal collapse, right? Which I think was a result of uh, just the size of the empire and straying from their founding spirit. But if you look at maybe, let's say, the Scandinavians, they had their kind of Viking golden age, and where they basically just abused continental Europe and extorted them for wealth. But they didn't have as many resources up there, and they kind of relied on this extortion and this raiding. So when continental Europe gained strength, um, the Viking Age kind of declined, and eventually, for political reasons, they converted to Christianity. So you could say, oh, there you see a cycle of history, right, where they had this golden age, and then they were eventually kind of culturally conquered or assimilated by the people they once raided. However, it's still different because it's not, you don't see this kind of decadence, right? Whereas in the United States and in Rome, there's kind of no impediment to their power, and yet they still decline anyway due to internal reasons, not from being conquered, which is what's interesting. And even with the advancement of technology, could it stop this, or would it in fact actually worsen it, right? Because there's the whole mouse utopia theory, right, which is basically a kind of scientific study to back up the idea of decadence, that the more civilized you become, the more you rely on these kind of urban civilizations, the more out of whack you basically become, out of touch with your own nature, until the whole society just breaks down.
This is one potential effect of technological growth that I explore in my new book, Promethean Dreams, where essentially, ultra abundance and ultra technological growth, which is sort of directed towards consumption. It's directed with this sort of, liberal kind of orientation. Everyone just ends up being these sort of essentially, dopamine drug addicts, whether it's legitimate drugs, virtual reality, or whatever. They become addicted to this. And, lots of different philosophers explore the idea of post-human history. Essentially, when technological acceleration gets to the point where clearly it's going to change uh, the very essence of humanity, whether that, you have films like the Terminator, well, where the new technology attempts to wipe out humanity. You have films such as Blade Runner, for instance, where the replicants are sort of this overman. They're smarter, they're stronger. So it's a sort of organic robotic fusion, right? It's almost like a cyborg. You see this in the Alien series, for instance, where in fact what happens, and this is a bit of spoiler, but so in the Alien series, and like I said, spoiler if you haven't seen all the movies, but essentially there's these engineers who are these superior humanoid beings. They're like 8 feet tall. They have pure white skin, black eyes, super jacked, and one of them sacrifices itself to essentially begin the evolutionary processes on Earth by drinking this black liquid. And you've probably all seen the memes of that particular scene. And from there, that's how human evolution starts in the Alien universe. So this figure is almost like a Prometheus, right? He sacrifices himself so that mankind can come about. But even within this, the engineers, as they're called, which is, the race of people who came before us in this universe, eventually get overtaken by humans indirectly. So what the humans do is they build a replicant, essentially, or like a robot that mirrors a human, and it's named David. And this David guy, after a failed mission to this planet, he actually gets, he reverse engineers or whatever one of the engineers' ships, and he goes to their home planet and he wipes them out himself. So then something that is created by the humans, this sort of post-human, almost Ubermenschen type, being, ends up taking primacy over the whole universe. He becomes the most powerful individual. So I guess something that I think is interesting to explore is, what the liberals and the Marxists and the Spanglers and just, both the left and right, what they fail to recognize is the potential that technology has potentially to lead to a concretized post-human history. So the end of history could be the end of human history, the way that we essentially recognize the essence of humanity today. So for instance, Heidegger is very critical of technological growth and technological advancement because it believes that it will sort of be the end of human history, that we'll lose our essence of humans and become something else. Whereas the Nietzschean position almost seems to suggest that it's a good thing that we go beyond humanity. And I'll try to wrap this up because, again, I'm ranting a little bit. But what the Marxists and the Hegelians and the Fukuyamas fail to recognize is they think that the end of history is this perfect human history. It's the happily ever after at the end of a fairy tale that Disney, tries to sell you. It's this, for the Marxists is, okay, we have no property. We're all equal. We're living on our little farms, yada, yada, yada. I get my homegrown milk. You've been longhoused. Your fat wife, milks the cows in the day, and you're skinny and you grow potatoes all day. You're happy. You're so happy. And then the Francis Fukuyamas are essentially, they're almost seeing my book's view of history where everyone's just pumped with pleasure, and everyone has abundance. But look, clearly, as Ark has pointed out, whether it's Rome or America, that even in moments of abundance, we actually grow weaker, right? We actually grow more decadent and more susceptible to decline and fall. But this idea of post-human history, especially with gene editing and the potential to fuse artificial intelligence with organically. Imagine if we could essentially create this organic vessel and make its consciousness or make its brain attach that to artificial intelligence, and you could perfect humanity, whether it's gene editing or the creation of this sort of replicant, and you could essentially get rid of all of the predispositions which make humans decline, which makes humans weak, right? And of course, there's a lot of danger to that, as we see through all these dystopian science fiction films, right? Like Terminator. But, at a certain point, if history is progressing, right? Even though it has ebbs and flows, it does progress technologically. And if the technological progression leads to a point where it's inevitable that there will be a post-human history or beings that are superior to humans, then either you allow yourselves to get destroyed by them. Of course, Nick Land believes that we're just heading towards annihilation. The computers are going to kill us all, blah, blah. Or you find a way to insert yourself into that, to make yourself part of the ontology of what is post-human. So you give birth to the post-human, or you find a way to fuse your organic self to that new post-human self. And I know this is super, convoluted, random stuff, but I guess what I'm trying to offer here is the potential for post-human history to lead to an end of human history, but then the beginning of a new kind of history enabled by superior intellectual capabilities, superior technological capabilities. Maybe post-human history is where these 8-foot tall Promethean looking beings who are just exploring the galaxy, right? So I guess I just want to offer that as a potential answer to another sort of end of history theory.
Well, this may be a little bit of a pivot, but did you see that they're bringing back woolly mammoths?
I did see that. Yeah, it's pretty cool, I think.
Yeah, and they made these little woolly mammoth mice to test out their technology, which are very cute. I'd like some pet woolly mammoth mice. But I think that's interesting because you talk about gene editing and all of this stuff. If we get this kind of technology to bring back species and restore habitats and everything, could we actually see technology lead to a kind of rewilding of the planet and of humanity itself? Because I've been thinking about it. I've been wondering, do we need the wilderness? Do we need the steppe? What happens when, as is currently the case, basically the whole world becomes civilized? If you have a collapse, then is the whole world plunged into a dark age? What exactly happens? Because we've never really seen that before. There were always barbarians at the gate, who were in the wilderness, ready to kind of reconquer civilization, and that way kind of imbue it again with nature.
Yeah, well, going off of that, there is the aesthetic side to consider, right? People go to zoos, even though tigers are almost extinct from the wild. Why do they go to zoos? Because they enjoy looking at tigers. So I think we have a unique opportunity to do exactly as you say. Especially, look, I'm very skeptical of all this lab grown meat stuff, right? But imagine, for instance, if you could just have like this is a really dystopian thing, but imagine you have a skyscraper cow farm, right? And imagine they're strapped. No, I know it sounds crazy, but imagine you just had a skyscraper full of cows and they're all strapped to this like virtual reality thing, which makes them happy. It makes their meat taste better because they're happy, kind of like what they do with wagyus, but more mechanized. You wouldn't need as much space. You wouldn't need as much, of the wilderness cut down or whatever to sustain this, right? Technology could, currently we see a lot of the negative ramifications of technology in terms of using up all these resources, right? But who's to say that we can't eventually use technology in a way where we don't have to use other resources as much? Of course, this is the whole deal with electronic energy, right? The idea is eventually we won't have to refine natural gases, and we'll be reliant on electronic energy. And of course, that's a long ways away until we're completely dependent on that. But what you say, I think there's aesthetic side to consider where we do want the wilderness, we do want the steppes. Maybe there's not this real connection anymore, but I think there is something beautiful and there's something essential in that, and something that I personally would like to preserve, and I think a lot of people would like to preserve that too. And especially in all these science fiction books, take the science fiction book which inspires Blade Runner. Essentially, what they're trying to do is they're trying to get everyone to emigrate from Earth, because Earth has just turned into this wasteland. It's turned into this horrible place, and it's hard to live there, right? And it's not economically feasible. It's better to just send people to these off-planet colonies. Imagine if we started doing that before the Earth became environmentally destructed, for instance, right? Or imagine, right? Here's my sort of not dystopian. Some people call us dystopian. Here's my offer for how I think we can arrange the end of history positively. I think, frankly, we do have an overpopulation problem in this planet. The problem is that the solutions to overpopulation are only being applied to Western countries or East Asian countries. So, of course, the European and the East Asian birth rate is incredibly low when most of the population growth is taking place in, continents like Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. So, I mean, India specifically. So imagine, right, if we got to this point of technological advancement where we didn't need a working class anymore. We didn't need, essentially a modern slave class. That's how a lot of these countries function for us, right? Mining lithium batteries in the Congo or whatever. Imagine you don't need that anymore, right? Because we have robots doing our slave labor. Now imagine at that point when you don't need a working class anymore. What if you told them all, hey, look, we have this abundance, right? But clearly you're taking up a lot of space. No, don't worry. I'm not going to go crazy with
We're
it.
going to deport them to Mars.
No. I'm a very humanistic guy, right? I love Fukuyama. I love Marx. I love Hegel. I'm so nice. I'm such a liberal guy. No, not really. But here's the thing. I'm a humane guy. So here's what you do. With all this abundance, you say, look, you will go through a surgery that effectively doesn't allow you to have kids anymore. Like the guys will have vasectomies, etc. You can still fuck, you can still have sex, but you're all going to get vasectomies. And in return, we're going to put you up in these, great mansions or whatever. You're going to live the rest of your life super happy, right? And now we have robots, population, an aging population is not going to affect us as much. And we do this in all the areas where you're not coming up with rocket scientists. You're not coming up with, biochemists and physics majors or whatever. Not the people who are actually going to be able to help us continue our post-human history. You're going to look to all the countries that don't produce, and people are saying, wow, that's eugenics, blah blah. Okay, whatever. I'm still being humane. I'm not saying we got to deport them to Mars, but I'm saying, like, let's give them economic incentives not to have kids anymore, and then in a few generations we're just going to have a very small population comparatively that's a lot smarter and able to help structure the post-human history. So now we can return a lot of wilderness to its past beauty, and we can essentially turn the Earth into this beautiful planet, right? Where it's not this sort of urban experiment like in Blade Runner, where it's just all cities and it's all dusty and all dark. No, we can reverse that, but we just have to take a couple steps, like I'm mentioning. So, like, I think that's a very humane eugenic experiment. I think that's very humane. Come on, they're doing it today already in some extent.
I mean, yeah, I think I'm not sure if you'll find many willing participants in this.
Oh, I think you will,
sterilization
though,
project.
because think about how many people don't have kids anyway in developed countries where they have their porn and their Cheetos and their video games. They just choose not to have kids anyway. So what you do is you force smart people to have kids, and you give all the Cheetos and the porn and the dumb shit to the people you don't want to have kids. It's that simple, and they're going to buy it. People are stupid. They'll buy it.
Well, don't give away your master plan. I mean, it's like Plato says, you're supposed to do the eugenics kind of on the covert. Like he has that lottery, the idea of the lottery, and it's rigged, but nobody knows it's rigged, and the ugly people just always lose.
Well, don't worry, Ark. I'm gonna be telling this to somebody who hides the master plan. I'm gonna be the guy behind the scenes feeding all the information. I won't be doing the plan, okay? So don't worry about that.
But yeah, I do think, I always think the birth rate, the narrative around the birth rates thing is insane, where people are saying we need to have more kids, we need to have basically an exponentially growing population, which to me is nuts, because I think Western countries, in my opinion, are already overcrowded, and we could, reduce the population by tenfold, and it would actually be much nicer, and there really would be no issue with that. You have the economic considerations. How do we maintain all the infrastructure? Well, I think an easy solution would be if we just kind of bulldoze everything besides the Northeast and just turn it into a giant, nature reservation. We bring back woolly mammoths, maybe saber-toothed tigers. They can also help control the populations, and then we have the steppe restored. And I think that's a much more elegant solution than, just trying to force people to have as many children as possible.
Yeah, I think it's twofold, right? Like I said, you want certain people to have lots of kids. You want the like the sort of Platonic experiment with the Republic, right? You want to make sure there's as many golden children and golden parents as possible. So I'm not necessarily advocating, currently that plan's going to work. It's a long process, but eventually, for example, let's say you could reduce, in a few generations, you can reduce the world population from 7 billion to just 1 billion, right? And then from that billion, imagine if half of them wanted to be a part of these off-world colonies, because eugenically, we're going to produce more children that want to embrace their Faustian side, want to embrace that ambitious side, and want to explore. They're smart. They want to be astronauts, whatever. And then, imagine the Earth with 500 million people. How much, nature we could recapture for the wild. And that's what's great about interplanetary space travel, and again why I think technology offers like such a new view of the end of history, because it's the end of human history the way that we understand human history today, and the way we understand it throughout the limitations of most of human history and most of our biological and evolutionary history. But if we go into interplanetary species, for instance, that all changes, right? So much changes. And I think it will be for the better. We just have to have the right people in charge that, essentially promote the right things and promote the correct systems, which are going to lead to a more beautiful future. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think you could also make your plan simpler. Just you get a child and you put in front of them a copy of, uh, the Communist Manifesto, or maybe Marx's entire collective works. A really massive volume, and then on the other side Nietzsche's collective works, and whichever they crawl towards. If they crawl towards Nietzsche, you keep them. If they crawl towards Marx, then you launch them into space, just in a kind of small pod, and we're not sure where they go, but
I think it's
but
exceptionally based.
I think I think the thing is populations balance out naturally. There's definitely something to the mouse utopia um, experiment, um, but I think populations also just naturally kind of adapt, and birth rates naturally change with the environment. I mean, when you study evolutionary biology, there's all sorts of crazy things that happen with the birth rates, and even like the genders of the children being born. And so I think naturally, when people become too crowded, they begin to have less kids. And I mean, you see this happening even in China. The stereotype of China might be, there's just so many of them, and they're all crowded close together. But we see their birth rate is declining as well. And you could say this is a result of technology. Everyone's just addicted to their smartphones, and depressed and atheistic or something like this. But it seems like the more likely explanation is that perhaps human populations just naturally balance out when things get too crowded. And so when you had these steppes, these wilderness, you could just send the excess population out into the wilderness, which is one theory for how the Indo-Europeans spread, that they're just perpetually sending out these waves of young men, the Koryos, or whatever, and we don't know how historically accurate that idea is, but you do see this trend throughout history. And Europe did it during the age of exploration with basically the whole world, right? Just sending out guys to conquer various places and to settle. But I think that's another issue. I also with mass migration into the West is that if the population is what's actually happening is that the population is naturally balancing out, then if you keep sending more and more people there, it will never balance out, right? Because you'll just keep creating more crowding, basically. Whereas perhaps if let's say the United States had a massive wall built around all of it, even in the ocean, a kind of
The Great
massive
Seawall.
massive Trump wall, exactly. Perhaps what we'd see is that the population would decline significantly by 50%, maybe even by more. But then maybe after that, we would see a kind of renaissance. Um, so yeah,
I think
something to consider.
Yeah, I think the what I would posit as a slight, argument to that is that for most of human history, we didn't have the same pressures or lack of pressures on the flip side that we do today. So for instance, leftist ideology is very clearly oriented towards this sort of hatred of natural instinct, this hatred of, the natural aggression, right? They want to pacify us. They want us to turn into these domesticated, euthanized, castrated animals, right? So that we're more peaceful, et cetera, et cetera. Or they just deny nature and they assume the sort of Rousseau's noble savage and like, oh, actually humans are naturally peaceful. It's only property that made us not peaceful, which is of course bullshit. But regardless, right, uh, of any of that, the leftist ideology, which is essentially a death cult, is is an existential threat in the sense that if there is not a swing of the pendulum significantly to the right, so for instance, you could easily think of a 1984 type scenario where you have this deep state government, whatever, which is run by these, leftist elites who are able to almost concretize their power and eventually lead to the destruction of whatever polity they're in charge of. And ultimately, like I said, the leftist ideology is oriented towards total death, right? They are having a lot less kids than people who are on the right, etc., which is also part of their weakness, right? Is the right is producing more people to replace them in the future, and this is one of the weaknesses of the left. But what I'm getting at here is you could say, yeah, populations will balance out over time, but it might not be the case if you retain a leftist political orientation. That could be true if there's a pendulum swing back right. So I guess what I think is the solution to that, and essentially, the solution to end decadence and to end, all these different things is almost like a Platonic uh, oversight to temporarily get rid of the issues. Of course, I don't subscribe to Plato's philosophy as a whole. I don't subscribe specifically to every single method of the Republic, but generally, making these sort of top to bottom changes, for instance, like I said, controlling who is going to, be the future population wise, right? Incentivizing the right people having much more kids and the wrong people having far less kids. And then, like you mentioned with the choreos, right? And sending, the excess population out. The only difference, I think, between what will happen and what happened before is in the past, you could just send the men out and they'll find some longhouse society and kill all the men and take all the women as brides. The only difference is, unfortunately, I don't think there's any alien baddies out in the atmosphere, in the galaxies, in the universe, waiting for us to impregnate them. So we'll have to take women with us when we colonize, space. But essentially, once we become an interplanetary species, effectively, it's going to be the same thing, where you're able to send the excess population out to colonize, space. The difference, though, is I think you need to have a very eugenic-based population. And the reality is that the eugenic populations of the Earth are going down and the dysgenic populations of the Earth are going up. Because like most of mass migration is not being done by astrophysicists and rocket scientists. It's being done by people with no legitimate skills. It's being done by people who come from cultures, for example, like majority Islamic countries, and I think everyone can see, that Islam is clearly an outdated religion, and these are the people that are coming in, right? They're not contributing to a more eugenic world population. The most eugenic peoples are the ones having the least amount of children because of the most intelligent countries today, generally, are being corrupted by this leftist liberal ideology. The only one that's not, that is, sort of eugenic, at least intellectually, is China. And that's because, Mao Zedong said, have 10 children each. And of course, they're like, holy fuck, Mao, you're dead now, but you've really fucked up. Now we have too many people, so we need to reduce the population. So China is the only low birth rate country that is having a lower birth rate, not because of, sort of leftist or liberal sort of principles, which is the case, I think, in America, in Europe, in Japan. You could also argue Russia and Iran are having lower birth rates, and that's not necessarily because of leftism. But I guess what I'm getting at is, I want that. I want this sort of, Faustian future where we're able, like Spengler thought the Faustian spirit was largely impossible in modernity because everything had been conquered. All the countries of the world had been colonized, all the continents colonized. But now with interplanetary travel, that all comes back again. And at that point, the only thing is I want a eugenic people colonizing space. I want a beautiful, intelligent people. And if all the beautiful, intelligent people are replaced by ugly and unintelligent people, we're just going to end up, in a shit show. So I think we have to be very careful about how we move forward with all that stuff and actually take, I don't think just allowing it to resolve itself is going to work. You know what I mean?
Maybe, but at the same time, I think there have been attempts at this throughout history, kind of, whether it's someone like Julian the Apostate trying to revive Roman paganism, or like you said, with the, Chinese birth rates, the one child rule, all this sort of stuff, it always seems to fail. It always seems like it just doesn't work. And perhaps what we really do need is the wilderness, and perhaps it's so I think the interesting thing is we use nature in two ways, right? We say, nature is all the trees outside, but then you also have a kind of human nature within you, right? So what's interesting then is you have nature actually inside of you, you could say, right? You have this nature, and then the kind of Maus utopia decadence hypothesis of civilization would basically propose that the issue with civilization or hyper-civilization is that this nature, your instincts, are unable to express themselves properly. And so it becomes kind of warped and distorted, and people start acting kind of strange. But, the barbarians who are still in physical nature, still out in the, hunting among the trees, they have a more kind of natural expression of their nature. They are allowed to express their instincts properly, and that's what keeps them healthy. So in that way, maybe it is actually just kind of the presence of space, right? And so if we sent, let's say, a population of Americans who, probably on the average are, pretty deep down the Maus utopia rabbit hole themselves. If we sent them out to a planet, let's say we discover an Earth-like planet, and we send out, let's say, 10,000 random Americans there. In a few generations, would we see when we come back there? Let's say we drop them off, we take the spaceship back, we come back. Would we see that they have developed again into a more healthy, quote unquote, natural society? Would they be then all worshiping a giant bear god, and and they're all jacked again, and is that what we would see?
Yeah, well, it comes down to the psychology that leads to decadence and all these different things. And I think, like I said, lack of stressors, right? Lack of stressors that force you to retain your beauty and strength, etc., right? You need these stressors. And I think that, for me, what the solution is actually precisely rooted in technology. See, the problem with technology today is that it's largely used for consumption. It's largely used for nefarious means. Once it's redirected outwards, right, and not inwards, all technology is sort of directed inwards now. You think about virtual reality, right? What is it being used for? It's being used for fucking porn, right? Inwards, keeping yourself stuck to yourself. Whereas, I mean, even within virtual reality, you could use virtual reality to learn how to be a fucking surgeon or something, or to put, astronauts through spaceflight training. Once we use technology outwards, right, towards molding the world around us rather than frying ourselves and narcotizing ourselves, it gives those stressors again. That stressor can be interplanetary advancement and riding the waves of technological advancement. So, I think, we can kind of find a fusion of both of the things we suggested, right? Like you said, if you put these people on another planet, right, you might see this return, but I don't see it necessarily as a return, but I see it as a going forward, going forward in the sense that now they do have those stressors. You're giving all these missions of, let's embrace this technology to essentially expand our will to power by expanding our understanding of the world, expanding our ability to control space and control the world. Because if we break down power on, a very basic diluted form, it's essentially control. What's control if not being able to control the physical world beyond ourselves in space? If we can secure the survival of humanity forever, for instance, let's say you could start terraforming planets. Let's say you can start, if there's an asteroid that was going to hit Earth, you could literally, pulverize it or find some other means of, circumventing that. Once we are able to perfect zero point technology, right? All these different things, you know, that allows us a lot more power in the sense that it allows us a lot more control over everything. And I think embracing progress in the sense of technological advancement, in the sense of expanding our world of power, and almost adding a spirituality to it, right? Making it a spiritual experience, not making it merely this sort of, you know, lame, petty, atheistic, materialist, reductionist sort of thing, which it's become with your, you know, Richard Dawkins and your Neil deGrasse Tysons, right? You know, you add a spirituality to things like space travel and technological advancement and expansion, because frankly, right, um, I think what a lot of Nietzscheans get wrong is this sort of Nietzschean barbarism, like, oh, you know, if we return to nature, if we return to these war bands, everything's going to be fine, you know, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I think it's a very romantic and very beautiful idea. I'd love to get on a pirate ship and become modern pirates with my boys, you know, taking down cargo ships with AKs and RPGs and surface to air missiles. Like, that's great. But realistic, you know, like, yeah, you love that. We'd do it together. But realistically, you know, the forces of mechanization are going to continue to advance, and you're going to end up like the South. You're going to end up as this very noble and beautiful aristocracy, but you're going to be overtaken by the industrialized North because they have embraced technology, they have embraced the future, and thus they have the mechanisms of power to overtake you. So we have to ride the wave if we want to have control over our future. If we want to be able to return to nature, we first have to ride the waves of technology so that we have the strength to return to nature, if that makes sense.
Yes, you do see these two camps, the kind of hyper technological ones, and then the kind of more return to nature fellows, right? The, you know, Ted Kaczynski, we need to tear it all down. And but what I'm interested in, I guess, is can you use civilization and can you use technology uh, to renaturalize and you know, blow Ted Kaczynski's mind completely? And I think, for example, you know, again, back to what we were talking about at the beginning with Rome, you know, what you see is there's this original kind of pagan founding spirit, right? The Roman people are descended from the god Mars. They have the classic, you know, kind of Indo-European pagan morality and ethos. You have the, you know, the Vestal virgins who keep the flame of Vesta alive. And so you kind of have this a strong ancestral tradition. But I think what that really is doing functionally is it basically keeps the Roman people in a certain way in contact with their nature, right? So uh, Mars, you know, the communion with Mars, for example, you know, keeping this ancestral flame alive. But eventually, you know, what happens is you know, Mars kind of fades into the background. They convert to Christianity. You know, the Vestal flame goes out. The question then, I think, is is it possible in civilization with technology to um, to use it to keep us in contact with nature? You know, whether that means, you know, clearing out Ohio and filling it with mammoths or having some kind of religious order, I'm not sure. But I think that is the real question: is, you know, can you in that way then bypass basically the effects of decadence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why Nietzsche is, you know, morally more so a pagan, but not literally a pagan. You wouldn't see him making ontological assertions based on a sort of metaphysics of paganism, right? But he loves the flavor of paganism. He loves the sort of outlook it gives somebody. And of course, even the early Greeks weren't necessarily sort of theistic in the modern sense. Of course, a lot of them were, but a lot of them certainly saw the gods as archetypes, right? Archetypes of will to power that if you followed them, it was going to grant you a certain bit of power back. I think you and I have spoken about this at length. So I think, you know, the sort of fusion that you want to deal with at the end of history and post-human history is you have to ride the waves of technology, but you have to do so with the correct orientation, right? And I think beauty ultimately is the clearest and wide. It's a wide enough tent that you can bring in all these different camps and still retain the essential spirit of, you know, this sort of good or this good movement, let's say, or whatever, the movement of good, the forces of good, etc., is by making your moral valuations based on beauty and aesthetics, because then you will do things like retain nature, or stay aligned to nature, while also not being trapped by it the way that the Kaczynskis are, or the way that a lot of the noble peoples of history were overtaken by the progressive people. And I don't mean progressive like liberal progressivism. I mean progressive as in embracing the future, right? So, I absolutely think that it's possible what you're saying, and I think the way you do it is by embracing aesthetics and beauty as the moral valuation, which is central to your sort of worldview and philosophical view. And by making beauty and aesthetics the central thing, you're going to retain all these good essences, all these good practices that you see in paganism, for instance. So I think you can't be and I know a lot of people disagree with me, and perhaps you do too. But I don't think you can take I don't think you ought to take paganism literally. I don't think you ought to think, well, there's some hidden metaphysical reality that we get closer to through different, practices and rituals, for instance, right? And this is the sort of Nietzschean position that there is no metaphysical truth, but that we are able to transvaluate and create things which essentially act as truth or act as metaphysics in a colloquial sense, right? So that's why I say when you need to spiritualize technology, it's by saying you spiritualize advancement and you spiritualize creation. You make that your religiosity. You make your religiosity tied to creation and advancement, all these things, centralized by beauty, centralized by aesthetics. And by doing so, you're going to end up mimicking a lot of things that the pagans did, a lot of those rituals, a lot of those practices, whilst also not being limited by the dogma of paganism and not being limited by the dogma of traditionalism. And I think this is why, this sort of Nietzschean futurist, sort of outlook is ideal. And also why the pure reductionist techno-futurist is wrong too, because at base, they don't recognize beauty and aesthetics as central to their worldview. Not all of them, at least, and you need to. So a lot of these guys are these, nerdy, kind of, skinny, lame people. But even guys like Zuck, right? Zuck's getting in shape. Zuck's, probably pumping himself with testosterone, working out and doing MMA. Jeff Bezos started dressing like a Don after he got dumped by his ex-wife, right? Like even they sort of see beauty and aesthetics as important and as central. So I think as long as you make beauty and aesthetics your central motivating spirit, then technology will develop in such a way that we get what you want and we stay on the waves of progress, if that makes sense.
Yes, although I can't help but then think of what Uberboy has been talking about, saying that will technology bring the triumph of the last man? You have Zuck, turning himself into kind of the Ubermensch, and then meanwhile all the kind of more well turned out people are trapped in some pod somewhere, paying Zuck $15 a month for a VR subscription.
It's a literal matrix. I think that's, maybe this is a little bit of, again, a dystopian sort of thing, but with gene editing, for instance, right? Imagine like all these nerdy people with like bad genetics, right? They don't look good or whatever. Imagine you just had like a Gattaca. I talked about this with Uber Boyo and Lance, Gattaca, like the future of Gattaca. It's sort of painted in a negative outlook, like negatively, like, oh, this isn't a good future. But I think the Gattaca future is exactly the future we need. Let's get the genes in like sperm. I'm serious. Let's get the genes in sperm that are the most attractive and most intelligent. Because frankly, everybody has like even like slightly dysgenic people. They have that one sperm that's going to maximize their genetics. If you selected that every time, even like these nerdy Mr. Urkel types are going to be pumping out 6'5", beasts, beasts of men and beasts of women, great titanic men and Amazonian women. Like this is very possible, again, with technology and gene editing, right? It's just as long as we recognize beauty as the central ideal. And I think people naturally are drawn to it when they realize that it's attainable. That's another thing. I mean, Nietzsche talks about resentment. All this envy and hatred of the slave comes from a position of believing they themselves can't have that power. So if eventually you get gene editing, you're like, oh shit, I can create a good looking kid. I'm going to do that. Holy shit. Beauty's cool. That's probably how it's going to develop. Like Zuck was like, shit, if I just start taking testosterone and working out, I can be a not nerdy looking weirdo. Okay, sign me up. So a lot of it is also accessibility, right? Greater accessibility to these ideals helps people get out of that slave morality resentment mindset and say, you know what, that's actually a good thing because now I can attain it.
We have to democratize the Ubermensch. We have to we have to. I mean, it definitely will be interesting if people can, if the like designer baby technology is easily available. What exactly will happen with that? Will everyone end up being 6'5" with blue eyes, or what exactly is it?
Well, I mean, even if it's like a recessive gene, like your great 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 grandparent or whatever had blue eyes, like maybe you can find that one sperm, with it, and you can be like, all right, you're looking like your Yamnaya ancestor, like why not? Let's do it. Come on, Ark, let's do it. Right? It's the time is now.
I unfortunately don't think that's how that works, but
not yet. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, essentially everything ties into the rules you sort of set for yourself when you paint, when you mold, when you create, right? And like as long as we can sort of set like rules that ultimately are going to lead the right direction, I think we can sort of allow for the correct path to be taken. But I see your point with like, what if we don't become the driver of technology anymore? But I think ultimately it's a risk we have to take because ultimately technology is happening. Nothing is going to stop technological advancement. If it is possible that AI can be sentient and conscious, it's going to happen. There's nothing we can do to stop it. Even if we were somehow able to pass all these regulations, some nerd in his basement is going to fucking create, this advanced AI at some point eventually, right? This is all very accessible. So it's going to happen no matter what. If it's possible for AI to be conscious and sentient, it's going to happen. So my thought is if it's going to happen inevitably, then we have to be doing everything we can to ensure that, one, it doesn't annihilate us, and two, we find a way to use it to our benefit. And I think the way you do that is by, whether it's organically breeding or a mix of organically and mechanically breeding, this sort of post-human Ubermenschen Overman type individual, because like I think we can, like, do you think it's do you agree it's like probably inevitable? Like, is there do you think there's anything we could do to stop technological advancement realistically?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think technology is such a curveball. I think the other thing is that it develops in ways that we can't necessarily expect. So like we all have this one kind of vision of what the future will be like. But I think, it's very possible that, new technologies come out, which take technology in a completely different direction. Um, I mean, what's a good example of that? Maybe something like the smartphone, right? You might imagine in the 1800s, everyone thought of the future as being like, oh, we're going to have these very maybe fantastical cities where you have kind of flying cars and hot air balloons everywhere, and right, and all this kind of mechanical technology, right? Maybe we're even going to have, be in space and have a little space trolley to the moon, or who knows. But then what it turned out that technology went in basically a digital direction where we don't have, of course we've made advancements with, cars and planes and all of that, but we don't have these, cities with hot air balloons floating around and, different trolleys in the sky and this sort of stuff. It expanded mostly into the digital realm, in terms of the, kind of impact on the average person. So I think it's very hard to make predictions with that sort of stuff, and then also to, predict how that will actually affect us.
Yeah, and like I said, I think the direction that technology is advancing is inevitable, in the sense that it's going to continue advancing, right? Then, what becomes of us is, if all this is inevitable, it's like we have to uh, allow for its creation in such a way that it's going to be most beneficial to our worldview, most beneficial to what we want technology to do for us, right? So I think like a fear of it isn't going to do anything. A fear of like, well, it could turn out poorly. For example, like you mentioned, 50 years ago, we probably didn't imagine, how it would be today. And of course, you see this in science fiction, right? Like the Blade Runner universe looks nothing like modernity does. In fact, modernity looks a hell of a lot better than Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner, because in the original Blade Runner, right, and the original book by Philip K. Dick, the Cold War is still going on. Everything's industrialized. The world is falling apart. Like dust storms is killing the world, and like we're doing a hell of a lot better than that. So obviously, you can't guess where technology is going to go, but you can always guess that it's going to move up, right? It's going to advance. It's going to get more intricate. Short of an apocalypse happening, nothing's going to stop technological growth. So like no matter what we do, it's going to happen, and the best we can do is try our best to make it work for us. I guess is my position. So I think the reason why I believe in adopting a techno-futurist position, and your unique techno-futurist position, because also all those things that we talked about already, all those ideals and positions that we have, but you have to embrace it. This sort of trad, like we said, the trad return to nature is gone. There's no going back to that, right? It's not going to happen realistically. So the best we can do is try to make technological advancement work for us. But like I said, and like you said, it's not clear where the future is going to go. We can't predict. Maybe my big eugenic experiment is going to fail, and I'm going to be tried by the ICC in The Hague for war crimes. But I got to try it. I'm just trying my best, man.
um, yeah. I mean, I think though at the same time that's where I'd argue for more of a traditionalism, because of the very fact that we don't know where technology is going to go. So, for example, like we've talked about, perhaps technology, it really goes in this kind of terraforming direction, right? And that's the really new, unexpected technology. Like, let's say, right now we're all hyped about AI, and we're thinking there's going to be this possibly digital future where the machines are lording over us. Well, what if this company, I think they're a Russian company, I'm not sure, but this company creates mammoths, right? And this like shocks the world. Everyone's like, wow, you've basically brought mammoths back to life, even though they're kind of hybrid, elephant hybrid. Maybe you have then a more of a Jurassic World future. You start having mammoth theme parks. They release mammoth into the Arctic tundra to save the planet. And maybe that kind of technology then really takes off, and you start bringing back all these different species. You start having these different kind of terraforming projects on Earth. Maybe it's so successful that you do it on Mars, and in that way, the advancement in technology would actually lead to a renaturalization of man and of our environments, and then we would kind of have almost a new frontier, or kind of an eternal wilderness, right? If you start doing that to planets. So I think we absolutely should embrace and use technology, but since it is so unpredictable, that is why we need something, a tradition which connects us to the past, a flame that can be passed on every generation. And so I would hope that even if thousands of years from now my descendants are on a different planet, they would still be worshiping Mars, and perhaps still adhering to some version of the ancient codes of honor and hospitality and so on.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to that at all. For me, it's more so about just ensuring that whatever you choose to ground yourself to, that it doesn't hold you back from increasing the tether you have to that grounding. Like you need an anchor, right? to position yourself from. You need a tether, but you want that rope to be endless in terms of how far you can get from the original grounding, and but still being grounded to it. I guess what I mean is, right, you can't be constrained by metaphysics, right? This is the whole this is my whole thing, is like, you cannot be constrained by dogma. You have to let it enhance you, and if you find that it's no longer enhancing you, then you have to do something about it. So like, I'm all for the archetypes, right? I think the archetypes that you get from paganism are very essential. But like I said, I don't consider myself dogmatically pagan, for the reason that I do believe that they should be treated as archetypes rather than as, literal. And of course, this goes back to Plato with the noble lie. Ought we tell the noble lie to most people? Ought we tell the noble lie that, well, actually the gods are real and all this stuff is written in a holy book, right? To keep the majority of people in line, and then, the 10 or 1% elite know the truth. That's a conversation to be had. But, for us, who I'd hope, at least aspire to be elites, perhaps we are cast down to the shadow realm, but I believe you and I, Ark, aspire to be elites, right? Should we follow the noble lie, or should we know that it's a noble lie, and a noble lie we tell ourselves and others, but we know the truth deep down? So again, with traditionalism and all these things, of course, I find them important. I see the utility of traditionalism, right? But should we actually, believe in those things? I guess we can, since we're sort of reaching the end here, that could be the final question. We're talking about the end of history. We're talking about that final point where, I think, at the very least, I think we've sort of come to the conclusion that the end of history in the Marxian liberal Hegelian sense is not real. It's not true. But there is an end of history in the sense of the end of human history and post-human history. Having said that, right, what's going to live on in the post-human history? And when we look at traditionalism, right, and we look at paganism, right, do you believe, Ark, that we ought to genuinely believe in these things, or that it is essentially the noble lie? Because I subscribe to the noble lie being told to most people, potentially. Although my only difference is, instead of the noble lie, why don't we worship real people who become gods, right? Why don't we worship, like someone like Napoleon should be a god to the French, but in the sort of futurist era, we'll have new Napoleons and new great men. Those people should then be canonized upon their death, in some sort of doctrine. We'd be like, all right, these guys are gods now, because of their accomplishments in this life. But I am partial to the noble lie that we can tell most people, potentially, though like I said, I'd like us to worship actual people rather than, have to tell the noble lie. But I'm partial to the noble lie. But my question to you is, do you believe that it should be the noble lie, or do you believe that we should actually believe?
No, I think it's real. I think it's all well and good to say it's archetypes until the gods actually start speaking to you. And I think the irony too is that Jung, who came up with the idea of the archetypes, uh, that idea came from him basically rationalizing intense visions he had, where basically various gods were speaking to him. But I won't go off on a big rant. But I'm basically of the view that, again, your kind of ancestral religion is tied to your nature, so it is really kind of part of you essentially, and that you cannot escape it, and that insofar as you stray from it, you become in some way ill or distorted.
And going off of that, it comes down to, do you believe that when you have dreams, that's some sort of divine intervention, or is it your own body, your own mind telling you something, right, based on your experiences, based on your genetics, right? Like blood memories are sort of proven to a certain extent, through science, like not to the levels yet, at least, that we'd like to think of them, but there is some level of genetic memory passed on in humans, right? Which is, some people can say it's instinct, but I think it goes a little further than that. So are these dreams, are these feelings that we have, are they genuine metaphysical, messages that we're receiving, or is it a culmination of our biology? And of course, this is where the egregore comes in. And some people characterize an egregore as essentially this mass consciousness that gets developed through generations of spiritual worship, of believing in a specific archetype or entity, right? I mean, sometimes I wonder if Jung actually was a genuine Christian or not, because a lot of what Jungian, um, a lot of the things that he taught, like for example, Jordan Peterson, for the longest time wouldn't say he actually believed in God. Now he does, but for the longest time he wouldn't say that because he was going by this sort of meta narrative thing that he gets from Jung. Um, so, like, is that a genuine metaphysical? I guess another last question: is that a genuine metaphysical message you're receiving? Is it the culmination of both your genetic memories and your current memories and experiences? And third, does it matter?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, but I think maybe this is like a Jordan Peterson answer. But if, let's say, a specific God, uh, which you could then say, okay, maybe this God is just a construct of ideas or instincts or something like Jordan Peterson does. But if whatever this thing we call a God is tied kind of genetically to a people, tied into their biology, to their consciousness, and then if you acknowledge the fact that the worship of that God can kind of um, uh, activate that person in a unique way, and that perhaps people, individual people or collective people could even be possessed by the God in a certain way. This is Jung said, during World War II, Odin came down, he possessed the German people to harvest souls. I'm not sure, if I buy that narrative, but if you acknowledge that, then in that way they are real forces which can really affect the world. Then I think that's at that point discussing it further is more just about minor details.
Yeah, and I could agree with that. So I guess that's kind of, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to misunderstand your words. But that's like sort of saying it doesn't matter whether necessarily it's truly metaphysical or not, because the utility of it is such that it essentially is metaphysical, in the sense that the effects it has, it doesn't matter whether it's truly metaphysical or not. Um, I mean, is that sort of what you're saying, or I don't want to misappropriate your words?
Yeah, I mean, in a certain way, yeah, I'd say so. I think what would be maybe another example might be, well, you could just take instincts, and I don't want to reduce the gods to instincts, but I'm presenting, how I would argue in favor of paganism, maybe to an atheist or something, right? Uh, kind of, palatable arguments. Um, we refer to something like sexuality, right?
Hmm.
And that is obviously shared across all people and even animals, but it's basically a certain nature, right? That it's this kind of cluster of instincts. It's common to basically most life forms. It's common to all people, and it's this whole pattern of behaviors, drives, instincts, and so on, right? And but the question, I mean, you could say, is it real? Like, what exactly is sexuality, right? It's not like a thing that you can necessarily grasp, but at the same time, it affects people, it drives them to action, and it's the actual force which continues life each generation. So it's probably one of the most real and tangible and important things in that way. Um, and I think you could kind of say the same thing, about the gods.
Yeah, and like I said, we'll kind of wrap this up. I think it's a good place to end it, because, like I said, when it comes to post-human history and essentially being able to mold technology properly, all these questions are very important, because we have to have an ethos, right? Without an ethos, we have nothing. And this is why I think people like Neil deGrasse Tyson saying philosophy doesn't matter is so stupid. Like, you're so retarded, because reductionism and materialism does nothing to tell you what you ought to do. with material. It doesn't tell you what you ought to do with techniques and technology, right? So you need the ethos. You need to ponder these questions. You need to understand what your tethering is, what your anchor is. So I think it's all very relevant to the end of history, because what happens afterwards, right? When we have all these things at our disposal, right? Such power to create and destroy, we need to have the proper ethos to guide us to use these things properly. And, slightly different from yours, my personal view is that, we ought to have individuals become gods, or represent gods to humanity, because I think, here's another thing though. Once we, let's say the robots take over as our serf class, we won't need peasants anymore. So maybe we won't even have to tell the noble lie, because we won't have dumb people anymore. Everyone will be smart. And then you won't need to necessarily, need to worship anyone. Then we can kind of go back to this very, like everyone's smart. All right, worship the gods as you wish. But you still need a framework, obviously. But then maybe you don't have to be so literal, right? Once we have robot slaves that we can just, code to do whatever the fuck we want. But anyway, I'll wrap it up there. But Ark, any last thoughts and words from you?
No, I'll just say I'm very excited for the potential of having a pet mammoth in the future, which I could ride, or even some of those cute little furry mammoth mice. I'd be happy with having those as pets. So, also if we can maybe make like perhaps a mammoth cat or a mammoth dog, that would be I'd be interested in that as well. Very kind of shaggy, almost like a Muppet. Yeah, that's the final note I'll leave it on. It was a very kind of winding conversation, but I think a good one.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to create Pegasi, not mammoths personally, because I want to fly on horses. That'd be cool. But I like the mammoth thing. That's cool as well. I'll get a mammoth as well. Why not? But anyway, yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. It's been a bit since we've talked on a video. Obviously, Ark and I send letters to each other every day, via pigeons. Because we have to always be in contact at all times. Because I'm actually his pharmacist, and I prescribe him his what's it called again? The shit that the gods eat.
The nectar and
ambrosia. Yeah, I'm his ambrosia dealer. I make it in my basement and I send it over to him. So we keep in contact. Anyway, all jokes aside, thank you Legionaries for watching. As always, purchase Promethean Dreams, my new book, because, I don't know, you might learn something. It kind of goes into the things we're talking about a bit. So anyway, hail to the gods, victory to the gods. Let's begin the cultural renaissance so that we don't use technology to annihilate ourselves. Let's use it well. Anyway, but yeah, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy, and we will see you Legionaries next time. Away.